続きまして、海外からリーガル・ジェネラル・インベストメント・マネジメントの鳥下チェン様にご講演をいただきます。
Hi, Trista. Can you just do a simple self-introduction?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Trista. I am the head of investment stewardship with LGIM, looking after our activity in Asia outside Japan. So very happy to join you virtually. I'm based in Singapore. So for the next 10-15 minutes, I will be sharing why nature is such an important topic for investors like LGIM. And then we'll also share a little bit of what companies should do in responding to investors' expectation for the topic of nature. Thank you.
Sure. Can you see the slides yourself?
Yes, okay, I can. Yeah. Next page, please. So before we get into why investors care about nature and what companies should do, I thought it is important for us to set the understanding of what we actually mean by nature and what we mean by biodiversity. We do see that there's increasing attention, especially after the COP15 in Montreal end of last year, with regard to the nature and biodiversity agenda. But often those topics are not as well understood as what we have heard, for example, related to climate. So when we talk about nature, we actually mean the land, the ocean, the fresh water, and also the atmosphere that were created at the same time as Earth. Well, when we talk about biodiversity, that is basically all the living things that exist on Earth. They can be from the animals, from plants, from microorganisms that coexist with us as human beings. So nature provides us with the product, for example, the food, the medicine, the energy, the material that we have. And also at the same time, it serves us in terms of, for example, regulating the climate. It also provides us the environment so that we can enjoy arts, culture, and recreation. And hence, it is very important for us to understand how we can care about nature. Next page, please. So when investors like Legal and General Investment Management talk about nature, we think that our economy is actually embedded within nature rather than external to it. Nature is fundamental to the long-term health and economic and social system, as I introduced what it actually encompasses. And there are compelling statistics. It happened that, for example, in the last 50 years, we have a decrease of close to 70% of the monitored wildlife population, and biodiversity loss is now considered a major global systematic risk. There are also related global GDP data when it comes to what happens to us should the severe biodiversity loss continue to happen for economies that is moderately or highly depending on the nature. The latest study from the World Economic Forum, as is shown on the right-hand side, you can see that nature and biodiversity are considered as the top two risks when it comes to the next 2 years. And then it's also considered as the top third, the fourth, and the sixth when we're looking into the 10-year spectrum. So this is why, aside from climate, the global society, especially in the investor world, we start to pay further more attention about how we should address the topic of nature. And we consider that if we fail to address nature, it is expected that by 2050, we may accumulate a loss of $10 trillion. So this is the impact that we are talking about in terms of the nature loss. Next page, please. At LGIM, we actually have been looking at nature for quite a long time. So on the left-hand side, you can see that this actually encompasses of the six what we call the priority engagement themes, and nature is one of them. Nature, the light green portion, encompasses of biodiversity topics, water, deforestation, and also circular economy. But I also want to point out that nature is not a topic that stands alone. It is well integrated and connected to the other engagement priorities that we care very much at LGIM, and that are highlighted in the dark green boxes. So this includes the full agenda of climate topic. This also including human rights, human capital. This is also to do with the health that we have in terms of the human beings from both the antimicrobial resistance and then also the nutrition that we will need to take from nature. This is also very much related to topics like governance. We think companies and investors have a strong role to play when it comes to lobbying with the governments and other regulators to increase the disclosure standard and also performance. And last but not the least, in order for investors like us to understand how companies performed with respect to their commitments and expectations on nature, similar to climate change and other agendas, we do think transparency in corporate reporting basically sit in the center and fundamental to topics like that. And generally in LGIM, we respond to the engagement priority themes that we just talked about in the approach that you can see on the right-hand side. So we normally will start setting our expectations by formulating our policy, and then we will articulate what we as a major investors will have expectations on the invested companies. We then will engage with regulators, with standard setters, with policymakers. This can be, for example, the latest joint letter that we sent together with an NGO in Europe to the G20 about why we think some of the nature topics should be included in the agriculture sector and how we consider those recommendations need to be reflected. So we also very much collaborate and knowledge sharing, such as the session that we attend today, so that we hope that the understanding of nature can converge among the investor communities and also across the companies that we hold shares in. And then we will conduct either collaborative or direct engagement with companies. And this is very much in responding to the policy that we have set and also the expectations that we outline with regard to the companies. But last not the least, LGIM has a strong track record of integrating ESG topics into our investment decisions and reflected in our tools. And I have further notes that I can share with you all later. Next page, please. We did talk about what nature is and what biodiversity is, but it's also very important to remember that when we talk about nature and biodiversity, we also need to remember the topic of deforestation. Why deforestation? Again, statistics shows that an estimated of 22% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission comes from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use. That means deforestation actually is a carbon sink, but with the destruction of the forest, it's actually released a significant amount of the greenhouse gas back to the atmosphere. Unfortunately, in the last 30 years, around 420 million hectares forest that were lost due to conversion to other land use. This is an estimation of 8% of the total carbon dioxide emission, which is about the same of the emission comes from the entire European Union. And that's why when we talk about protecting nature or restoring nature, we also need to be mindful of the activity related to deforestation. Next page, please. So LGIM, as a long-term investor, put front and center of responsible investment in our principle. We have been responding to the nature topic as early as 2016. And since then, we have published our policy with regard to deforestation and biodiversity. We are also in the process of formulating our overarching nature policy, including the 4 subtopics that I have mentioned. We have since also widening our assessment and engagement with companies with regard to the topic of nature. For example, last year, we started sending letters with respect to our deforestation ask to companies that we hold shares on. We have collaborated and shared, as I mentioned, with the G20 letter, and we also have been actively responding to the standard setting, for example, ISSB, in expressing our intention of how to bring the standard into a more global aligned and converged matter. LGIM is also known in expressing our decisions through our vote. So for those of you who may be familiar with us, that we do have a voting website that discloses our vote decisions around 24 hours after the vote is casted. And we do vote according to our policies, which including the topics of nature. But most importantly, as shown on the right-hand side, this is what we call the LGIM's proprietary environmental social governance score, the ESG score. So as you can see, in the last 5 years of development, we now have expanded the LGIM ESG score to a total of 34 topics. And as highlighted in the green topics, nature and biodiversity, including topics like biodiversity, water, and deforestation, are part of the environmental agenda that we evaluate on the company we invest. And we also will integrate the ESG and transparency performance into part of a fund investment decision as appropriate. So this is why the disclosure and also companies emphasize on the topics of biodiversity, water, and deforestation and overall nature will be critical, because we have already reflected this into our investment decision. Next page, please. And when we talk about the ESG score, we thought it is also good to give you an overview of how the Japanese listed companies are performed with regard to LGIM's ESG performance. So just to point it out that this does not include all the Japanese listed companies, but only capture the ones that are captured in the LGIM ESG score. And averagely, the listed Japanese companies are scored with the average performance of 35 across the environmental, social, governance, and transparency topics. And this is versus against a global average performance of 42 points. And you can see on the chart here, sectors like banks, real estate, and then also insurance sector, pharmacy, life science are the ones that generally perform quite high comparing to the peers. But on the other hand, sectors including consumer stable distribution and retail are one of the lowest sector. And this is also a sector that we have highlighted tremendously related to the topic of nature. So just to give you an overview, we as an investor, how we look at the market as a whole, and also we will bring this evaluation into one-on-one engagement with companies and investment decisions. Next page, please. And if you dive into the specific topic of the 3 parameters that we look into the ESG scoring, there are 36 Japanese listed companies currently captured in our deforestation score. And on the dark green side, you can see that 17 of them come from the food and beverage and tobacco industry, 9 from the household and personal products. And overall, that is quite low comparing to the overall companies that got scored in our ESG score. When it comes to the water management topics, this is slightly better. A total of 213 companies that have been captured in the score. And that the highest come from the material sector, food and beverage, and also capital goods. The last but not the least, when it comes to the biodiversity score, there are 32 companies. Again, this is where it comes from the highest from utilities, capital goods, and materials. And it's important to point out that the score that we use is actually not a rating that's similar to the other rating system. We actually have the ESG score methodology published on our website, and then we rely on third-party data provider to grab the data from the disclosures of the listed companies, and then we'll use the methodology to do the own scoring and ranking. So there's a great deal of transparency. The company can go to our website and check your own performance with respect to each parameters that we score. And then you can also see how your performance are comparing to your peers within Japan or also globally. We consider this is a strong, powerful tool to encourage company to continue to disclose, because transparency through company disclosure is a window that we value very much an investor in understanding the company performance. But it's also mindful to point out that disclosure performance is not equal to ESG performance. In understanding the ESG performance, we will go to engagement activities, for example, collaborative or one-on-one engagement with company directly in understanding what they have set the commitment, and then how do they address in the commitment and deliver the commitments that they have stated with respect to various ESG topics. Next page, please. So now we talk about why investors care about nature. I want to bring to your attention that these are the expectations that we as a long-term investors have on companies like yourself. On the right-hand side, you can see the box highlight a total of the 7 topics that we will have expectation on companies. And for those of you who are familiar with TCFD and also the draft version of TNFD, those topics should not be too strange to you. So from the policy perspective, we expect company to set an overarching commitment and from the policy standpoint in addressing how they would commit with relationship to deforestation and biodiversity. And due to the close nature of biodiversity and climate, we also encourage companies to integrate a nature-related policy to biodiversity strategy as to climate strategy where it's appropriate. And then to ensure the policy and the commitment can be fulfilled, we strongly recommend the company to have a governance with respect to the board and management oversight to ensure the commitments are made. And the commitments should be reflected and integrated into company strategy, into the actual and potential risk mitigation. And this should be reflected, for example, in the CapEx setting, in the company's operating cost spending, etc. While strategy are important, we also want companies to reflect and understanding what would be the risk and impact to do with its own operation, and also very important, the value chain in your supply chain with respect to the impact of biodiversity. Because often this is not just stand in your own operation, but this is to do with the goods you purchase, the operation that you have in terms, for example, joint venture, etc. So we do consider companies should identify the risk and also identify the impact they have through their operation, where often a high dependency on commodities. And the next step is that companies should have set corresponding metrics and targets so that they are able to measure the performance and understanding whether the risk and opportunity that have highlighted have been addressed related to nature dependency and then the impacts. And in order for investors and also the broader stakeholders to understand the performance, as I mentioned, we encourage companies to disclose their performance. And this can be through CDP questionnaire that has specific to the nature topics, or the upcoming TNFD should the framework be released in a couple of days. And lastly, we don't think this is a topic that any individual would be able to tackle on their own. Hence, we strongly encourage companies to collaborate with industrial associations directly or indirectly to advocate for policy making. Next page, please. Since we talk about our expectations, we also want to share why this is important to companies like yourself who have kind enough to attend the workshop today. So we do believe that this is not only the right thing to do, but it is also business imperative. It is estimated that up to 10 trillion of annual business net revenue generation opportunities exist related to nature positive transactions by 2030 should companies address this. We also see that due to the intrinsic link of nature and climate change, one would not be able to achieve net zero without tackling biodiversity loss and nature degradation. That's why we see the strong performance and leadership that Japan has posed when it comes to commitment of TCFD. Hence, we want to highlight the close relationship of those two agendas and encourage companies to start looking at nature as the same way that you have looked at climate change. We also understand that nature loss, if it's not addressed properly, would have humongous financial challenge for our society. And we also want to point out that aside from the business opportunity, the potential financial loss, there's also the increasing regulation drivers. For example, the EU deforestation-free product law that will come into place next year that may potentially be a trade barrier or even fines if companies that import and export into the EU market are not be able to declare that their products are free of deforestation after December 31st in 2020. And the fine can be up to 4% of the company's EU turnover. We recognize that this is not just a penalization or regulation compliance driven. We want to highlight the benefit of why companies should address nature. And this is outlined on the right-hand side. If company does this properly, they can be used similar as the other sustainability agenda in terms of accessing market. They can also access capital. An example is that investors like LGIM has reflected in the nature into our investment decision. And then the more company in performing, aligning with our expectation and reflected in the score, that is just one example of how access to capital can be granted through addressing of the nature topic. And this is also company can be strengthening their supply chain resistance related to the trade barriers. The company can know that how they import and export are managing the nature topics or not managing the nature topics, so that you can switch your supply chain in building a more resilient supply chain in managing the topics. So this is overall why we think companies should start strategically looking at nature, setting the policy, gaining the commitment from the board and management, and start integrating nature into your business decision making. Next page, please. So to wrap up, we were asked to share the specific expectation that we may have on the Japanese company. So I just want to highlight that why Japan plays a significant role when we talk about the nature topic. First of all, Japan listed companies have a huge role in the global market trade. So Japan has 6% of the global top 500 listed company by market cap, and it ranks the third globally after US and China. So this is when it comes to the importance of listed companies in Japan has the weight into global market. But more importantly, Japan as a trade deficit country are the 5th largest exporters and also the 4th largest importer when it comes to goods. And this accounts for 30% of Japan's GDP, according to the World Bank data. So we talk about often the topic of biodiversity and nature is not only existing in your own operation, but very much to do with the trade. We took the chance to look at what are the top 10 sectors when it comes to exporting and including by value that Japan has had last year. And you can see that this range from cars, machineries, electronics, iron, steel, plastic, chemical products, heavy metals, precision metals, and also pharmaceutical goods. And interestingly, the products or the sector that Japan has heavily exporting and importing are very much aligned with the sector that LGIM sees as a material to the topic of nature. So what we call the basic material industrials can be understood as the manufacturing industry. So this is very much where we see Japan has a huge role in utilizing the supply chain in the global outreach with the weight of the companies to drive the expectation of nature. As I understood, the webinar started talking about the similarities of nature and climate. So I also want to highlight the difference that where we see the developments of the nature topic comparing to the climate. We do expect the adaptation of the nature agenda will be much faster comparing to climate. So we will see a ramp up of companies adopting TNFD much faster than TCFD. However, the time that we have to meet the commitment will be shorter. We only have by 2030 to meet the commitment that have globally reached through the Montreal COP15 last year when it comes to nature. For the climate, the agenda, the schedule that had been set is 2050. So we only have 7 years remain, or 6.5, to meet the commitment that we have global reach to the nature. One thing we do recognize the challenge remains for nature is the data, which is quite similar to climate and other agenda. But we want to highlight that the data related to biodiversity is actually available, but the need is to link to the company level's performance. And TNFD is very much aware of that, and they're providing an open source that is centralized data facility that companies can use the data collaboratively. So more information should come out from TNFD after the framework is announced. And specific to the Japanese companies, we do recommend all of you to leverage your learning related to TCFD and how it can apply and integrate it into TNFD. We also recognize that the nature topic is not a silo topic that one can address within a single department. So we highly recommend companies to gain the board and executive management commitment to support and to address this across the department collaboratively. We also encourage the positive lobbying directly and indirectly with the industry association, because this is where we can pick up the speed and be faster in achieving the commitments that we all have pledged to make. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions from the audience. Thank you.